So anything that struck you yesterday that you want to talk about further, you have questions about, kept you awake at night last night? You're thinking, that's good. Processing, we'll get the coffee running here shortly. Anything that troubled you, excited you, reassured you? Anything? Robert? Oh, yeah, Robert? Jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is a problem, is it not? Some of your schools are on tribal land, some are not. Some are right beyond the border of the reservation, some are housed in the center of the reservation. Jurisdiction is a problem that hasn't been able to be solved in 200 years, and we're probably not going to be able to get it done here tonight. But I do think that there is a possibility to at least blur the lines of jurisdiction by increasing the communication, having more conversations with tribal council and tribal leaders, and making sure that we're letting each other know what we're doing, what our interests are. You saw Officer Rivas yesterday and the initiative from the Pro-Tribal Court. He took it upon himself to reach out to schools and let them know what was happening on the court side of things, so that the schools could know what to expect from him. And as his program is developing, as he told you, he's writing a code for his program. He's reaching out to the schools and asking them what they need. The first thing he found out he needs, as he told you yesterday, is he needs to clone himself about 10 times over. The geography is huge, the problems are huge, and his caseload is overwhelming. But he is reaching out to community members to try to select folks who might volunteer to, in essence, be deputized to do this work locally. So I think the jurisdiction issue is huge, but if we're going to have any impact on coming together about those combined issues we have, those common issues we have, we're going to have to reach out and communicate with folks and see where we can find areas to work together. I know there's been a great deal of concern about the presence of SRO, police officers, in and near your schools. And that seems to be an area where our communities are understaffed and where we suggest that we have specific needs. So, although that's a cost issue, there's lots of grants that can be written for those things too. So maybe working together and having some conversations about our common agendas would be of help. So, that was a no answer to a tough question, but I think that is the answer, because we have lots of work to do there. Yes. Other questions, burning issues, topics. I can't believe you didn't all stay awake last night instead of go shopping and talk about what we did yesterday. And your team was hard at work. We went right to work, right from here to team to work. Different from you. But we're glad to try and you can play Stuff the Judge today. We have questions for you. No, do you look like you have a question? Not yet?
That's his morning book.
I see that. Okay. Lost in space. All right. Well, we must have done a very good job. If you have questions or concerns or challenges about what we said, you good to go?
How do you tell the community what jurisdiction have an answer?
I don't know that you have good answers to our community. They're looking for answers as well. Any of you have better relations with the tribal authority? Anybody have any board members who are also on tribal council? Okay. How's that working? Is that helping the communication? Having a person who serves in both arenas?
Yeah, it works really well, especially for our truancy efforts that we're doing with independent.
Okay.
They're right there and they know the issues that we're dealing with because we came from that.
All right. Although we don't have any control about electing tribal council members or board members, that's certainly an autonomous move, but it seems like that's working for Hayes to have someone on both sides of that arena working together. What about you guys? Having a tribal officer positive for you? And remember, what's said here stays here, so if it's not a good experience, go ahead.
I think we've been informed by if there's money available to try to, like this past week there was money out for a bad issue. So he emailed us right to work together. I haven't heard anything back.
But hopeful that that
Well, it's just nice knowing that if the other end of the reservation is getting something, that it should be kind of fair across the board. These people make sure that we're being included.
That's great.
And he got us a new flag.
There you go. All right, so something's working, that's helping. If you don't have an elected official, school board member, and tribal council member, what about asking a member from the tribal council to come report at a school board meeting? Keep them in touch by hearing what's happening in their world and seeing where you can plug in. Would that work? Is that a positive? And the tribal council? I mean,
Yeah.
is that both? And how does that work?
It works, he keeps us informed, that's the biggest thing.
Okay. So particularly when there's any funding, any grant funding going on, or the tribe is going to release some funds for something, that would be great to know and be ahead of the line if you could. So that would be helpful.
Vice versa, we should go to their
Great point, Corinne. Is anybody doing that? Any school board members or elected or hired leaders going to tribe, yes, going to meetings, right? You find that helpful to you, Corinne? The superintendent goes involved? All right, so that might be a way to start creating that bridge between us, because there seems to be sometimes a great divide. So although we have separate roles and responsibilities, if we can find ways to communicate, that would be great. All right, anything else? What's the meaning of life? It's not the hokey pokey, but it might be. All right, well, I don't see Jeff wandering in, no one else does either. So, yeah, so Janine will take over for the next 2 hours. Thanks, Janine. Appreciate that. Sing and dance, which would you prefer?
baton twirling,
That'd be great. That'd be great.
It really will be a great show, more of a comedic effect.
Okay. So,
Bill's right now.
whatever directions on, we want them to.
Loosen up.
My man. Janine was doing her dancing.
Thanks, then.
Yeah, a little bit later in the evening, we never know. I said I could do my presentation first, but mine is going to dovetail so closely with yours because we worked on the details. So the transition is so smooth, though, you'll see in a moment. So. Well, see, he doesn't even remember it was so seamless. So I'm going to introduce you to a friend and a colleague, and give him a chance to grab his copy. And he can answer any burning questions you've got, and I'm sure you have many. We started off with the easy one, Jeff. How do we handle the jurisdiction issues on
Criminal jurisdiction issues?
any kind of jurisdiction? So Jeff Weldon is known to many of you. He is your go-to guy for legal issues, both preventative and getting you out of trouble after we've gotten in. So I know you know him, and if you don't, let me tell you that he's an expert on all things. And if he isn't, he makes it right, Jeff?
I'm not an expert on raising teenage girls.
But he's getting baptism by fire to do that. So he'll be an expert shortly. So with that, I'll give you the.
Okay, they have their notebooks still or not?
They don't have notebooks.
Okay. Do we have them with them?
I do have notebooks. If you want me to get notebooks, I can get.
Yeah, why don't we?
Okay.
Just, I think we'll do personnel
Yep.
stuff. Yeah, I thought, well, actually, I asked her to change my time because I got to go to Mount City this afternoon, but I thought I told her that I dropped my daughter off at Riverside this morning, so I apologize for being late. Anyway, so I'm not entirely sure I remember what Stevie said we had for time, but what I'd like to do is pick a couple topics that I've been working on, talk about those, but then have just make sure we have plenty of time for open roundtable discussions. So while she's getting her notebooks, are there issues that you want to make sure we get on our list this morning to talk about? Is it too early? Bill Parker, may I recognize you?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, good morning.
Bullying, I'll be asking the board in the next couple months to review our bullying policy. We had the workshop. We got the suggested policy from the School Board Association and Office of Public Instruction. And so just hoping to hear your words of wisdom in that area.
Okay. And I'm going to add student discipline policies anyway. one of the things that your board is supposed to do. You're supposed to routinely review your policies anyway, but there's a specific statute that says you have to review your student discipline policies every year. And it dovetails into bullying, but more specifically guns on campus. And so you're supposed to look at your student discipline policy at least once a year. And the reason I worry about that, not that you need to change your policy or that you would change your policy every year, you probably shouldn't, frankly, is that if something ever happened on campus, if, God forbid you have somebody who comes on campus with a gun and harms or kills somebody, and then the lawsuits follow, which believe me, they will. And one of the things they'll look at is whether or not the district was negligent in its duty to its students. And one of the things you have to do in this context is check your policy once a year, and there's no record that you did so. That's indication that you breached your duty to your students. In other words, if that's part of the process that's spelled out in the law and you don't follow it, then you may well be judged to be negligent in that context. So that's why that's important. Okay, that's good. Thank you, Bill. Bullying and student discipline. Dan, you're sitting there quiet this morning. What would you rather? Would you rather call me on the phone and I charge you for it?
No.
First off. That was one of my issues that I was going to bring up is personnel generally, but also now that we're in the middle of the year and heading into the spring, it's always a good idea to start talking about non-renewal of teachers and taking advantage of the right that you have as a board to non-renew teachers without cost, which is a very helpful tool that isn't always utilized the way that I think it should be utilized. So that's one of the issues. So bullying, student discipline, personnel issues. Superintendent evaluation is the other one that I want to put on there. Because we have that time of year, heading into that time of year, that I want to make sure that we think about superintendent evaluation. I just talked to a superintendent yesterday, or the day before yesterday, who actually set up a part of her evaluation procedure is a quarterly, I don't know what they call it, but a quarterly mini evaluation session with the board. And because oftentimes we'll have either board members or superintendents or others complain about something. Like student discipline, for example, that my daughter was out of school suspended for 3 days, and by God, as a parent, I'm upset about that, and I want the board to do something about it. Well, it really isn't appropriate for the board to take up an out-of-school suspension of a student, or worse yet, an in-school suspension. There's really no role for the board to take in that particular case. You attend to student expulsions, but what are you going to do? You're going to second guess your administrator as to whether that's the appropriate discipline. And I would argue, as a board of lay people, of parents and grandparents, it really isn't appropriate, generally speaking, for boards to weigh into that kind of level of review of students' discipline. So I always say in those cases, well, this is an appropriate topic for your evaluation of your superintendent in the context of how do you handle student discipline? In other words, how do you judge whether or not an in-school suspension is appropriate versus an out-of-school suspension? Those sorts of questions can come up easily and should in the context of evaluation. So this notion of having, I don't know if Stevie was the one I just mentioned it, I just talked to a superintendent who what's that? I was doing some interesting dancing before you came back in. That's the best I got. So anyway, the evaluation, I want to talk about that because that's an important thing, and you're coming upon the time of the year that really should be done. Okay, bullying, student discipline, personnel issues. What else? What else has kind of cropped up in the last month or two since I've seen it? Open and what?
Closed sessions.
Open and closed meetings, right? Oh yeah. I don't think this group, as a group, has talked about the new public information laws yet.
No.
That's been included in other training. So how many? Let's see. The last time I spoke to you was over at the Holiday Inn, I think, in June. Okay. So How many of you attended that session? Okay, so quite a few didn't. All right, so these are the topics I've got so far, Stevie. What else do you think we should, building student discipline, personnel, student superintendent evaluation?
I'm going to deal with policies and attendance, but if there's anything that you want to talk about truancy and expulsion.
Okay. Jim, you talk about maybe public comment? Yes.
Oh, that's struck a chord. You want to have more of it, Dan? Is that what you're saying?
Public comment at board meetings. Yeah,
It's not public crucifixion, it's public comment.
this is the rule of thumb. The higher you are in the food chain in the school district, the thicker your skin needs to be, right? And I mean, as superintendent, you are likely the highest paid person in the district and sometimes in the town. And so you get, as a superintendent, get to be kind of the lightning rod for a lot of public criticism. I think that's true of trustees as well. You're elected officials, so I think the higher you are in the structure, the thicker your skin needs to be, which is tough when it becomes personal, because it generally does. Well, why don't we start on open meetings and let me grab one of my notebooks. Let me grab Dan's notebook. Sure. Yeah, I'm just going to find the right page.
Dan, or Jeff, you have one.
Okay.
These notebooks are a compilation of some of the training materials we're using. We're going to collect these from you at the end of the day and keep bringing them out as we do training, because we learned quickly that some folks had them and didn't bring them to training number 2. So we'll take responsibility for bringing them back and forth. And if you have a burning need to have a hard copy in your district, then just let me know.
Well, thank you for going and getting these. So everybody, if you go to page 31 of the manual, the material, we'll spend a few minutes on what the open meeting law is and how it affects your board meetings and how you close meetings, if you ever close meetings, and how to attend public comment in those meetings. So here's just a quick summary of Montana's open meeting law. You've all had experiences where you have in an open meeting some sort of controversy. You anticipated the controversy, or frankly it came out of the blue. Those are always kind of a pleasure as well. And you have then people who either feel like they need to be in the open meeting with you, and it's really something that should be closed, or when you get to the public comment or the comment part on the particular agenda item, then all hell kind of breaks loose. There are really 2 important roles in that context. One is your presiding officer. It's your presiding officer who has the authority to control the demeanor of the meeting. In fact, I would say it's the presiding officer's responsibility, the board chairman's responsibility to maintain control of and demeanor over the meeting. And I always try to suggest if I'm involved in a controversy and I anticipate that there's going to be one of those holy hell public meetings, I generally try to work with the board chairman and then the audience in general to kind of set some ground rules. And one of the ground rules I always try to set is that members of the public, members of the board, employees who are there, whoever it is, keep in mind you're attempting to run a public school system. And as such, board members and members of the public should really serve as an example to your students on how civic discourse should occur, right? You think. So I always try to encourage people to be civil in their dialogue in a public meeting. You may be angry, you may be frustrated, you may think that everybody's corrupt, you may think that you were wrong, but it is still a public school system you're attempting to operate. And therefore, the level of discourse in that meeting should be a lot higher than you would elsewhere, because it is a public entity running a public school system for the benefit of children. Believe it or not, that's what public schools are actually operated for, is the benefit of children. They are not, the purpose of a public school is not public employment. The purpose of public schools is not to get elected to a board that you really want to be elected to. The purpose of a public school system is actually to educate children. So, yeah, I try to lay that groundwork. So, talk about respect and comments, civility and comments, that sort of thing. Okay, so the open meeting law is very deeply embedded in our law. It's in our Constitution. 1972 Constitution has very clear rights to the public to observe and participate in government. So the Constitution says, you know, we don't do government business in back rooms, cigar smoke-filled back rooms. We just don't do our public work that way. So there on page 31 at the top, you see the two constitutional provisions that are pretty clear. The public has the right to observe your deliberations, and they have the right to participate in your deliberations. We'll talk about how that participation is supposed to work. Halfway down, what meetings need to be open to the public? Well, all of your board meetings, the starting point, the premise of your board meetings is they're open. So all of your board meetings. If there's a committee working on something that could result in a change of board policy, that meeting should be open as well. Especially true if a trustee or two serves on that committee. So what the Supreme Court has told us is that there's work done in a public agency that could result in a change in policy or direction or budget or hiring or, let me set aside hiring of superintendents, what I was thinking of, but not necessarily teachers. Those meetings must be open to the public. And if you send somebody away from those meetings, you run the risk of being sued, generally by a local newspaper, because newspapers want to know what the story is, but they also, I think, consider themselves kind of the protector of the public right to know. And they get a bit self-righteous about that sometimes. I'm thinking the Building Gazette gets a little self-righteous about that sometimes. So if the notices have to sue a public entity, you know, they write the story about how that controversy unfolds, which is unfortunate. They generally couch it in the context of, you know, we, the newspaper, kind of the guardian of the public right to know. Well, my cynical side says, yeah, you're also selling newspapers. So all board meetings need to be open. Committees of the board need to be open, whether there's a trustee on the committee or not. So there. What kind of meetings should be closed? Let's start with kind of the routine work of your school district. Generally, if your administration has weekly meetings, principals or other directors, that sort of thing, those meetings, I think if we were pressed on it, would probably be found to be needing to be open, believe it or not. And the reason I say that is the case that we have in the Supreme Court on this topic pertains to the Commissioner of Higher Education meeting with university presidents. And the Supreme Court laid out this whole test. Supreme Courts are fond of laying out tests. And you know, they said, is it public funding that is pertaining to the meeting, and does the meeting result in something that will be recommended up to the Board of Regents and several other items. So I've always been concerned that if your superintendent has regular meetings with staff or principals or directors of programs or whatever, that you could theoretically have somebody come in and insist to sit in on those. If that happens, of course, it completely changes that dynamic. That meeting is now no longer really as productive as it was once because somebody is watching you. Kind of the worst case of that I found was a large school district, and the superintendent had regular monthly meetings with top level management. And they talked about everything from, you know, budget work, how's the budget going, to initiatives, to staffing and principals. So in other words, it was just a kind of a nitty gritty, we're going to spend the morning, they do a lot of work. Well, a trustee decided that it was a meeting that should be open to the public, therefore that trustee was going to start attending those meetings. Did the trustee have the right to start attending those meetings? Well, I suppose technically yes, because of the nature of the work. But was it appropriate for the trustee to go to those meetings? No. Because it completely changed the dynamic. I mean, nobody in that meeting was now going to be critical of the board if they needed to be critical of the board. They weren't going to talk as frankly because they didn't think that that meeting was as secure, so to speak, as it could have been. So that trustee really kind of ruined that process while that trustee attended to go. And I ended up talking to the board chairman, who said, you know, to that person, well, see if you can talk to this trustee and kind of rein them in and find out why does that trustee feel like she needs to attend the meeting, what does she want? And eventually it kind of petered out, but That was a good example of kind of the whole dynamic at that level of meeting changing, not for a good reason. So that's what meetings need to be open. Virtually everything. Bill?
I would and have had, I've asked trustees not to attend our admin meeting in the past. Not in Lakeview, we're okay. But for this reason, we talk about staff and students, and that is not a board, an individual trustee's right to know, or a board of trustees as a whole right to know individual staff evaluations or student discipline records or names or diagnoses of special ed conditions. I can go on and on. What?
I agree, absolutely. Right, and that actually, when I go back to like those working meetings, if the superintendent is actually calling those meetings and presiding over the meetings, theoretically the superintendent could say, okay, we're now going to talk about a special education program with a particular child. This meeting's now closed, and then the trustee would have to leave. But that just seems so artificial. But still, yes, sir.
It's an open meeting for the public. Do we need to give notice?
Yes, if it's a meeting that is subject to the open meeting law, then you need to get it.
Administrative meeting.
Oh, you know, yeah, there was a period of time where we kind of went through that generation. It's like, okay, do we now need to start noticing up every administrative meeting? And that kind of fizzled out. There never really was any sort of consensus on that. I don't think you need to, because it really is not as much as I just talked about, policy and, public work and spending public money and all that sort of stuff. It's really not the kind of meeting that the public would have a right to participate in, given the nature of the work of that.
So again, what's the legal basis for calling it?
An open meeting?
Yeah.
Well, what I'm doing is I'm taking this case out of the Commissioner of Higher Ed and drilling down to that level of meeting and saying, okay, the Supreme Court said if it's a meeting that is funded by public funding, is a routine sort of functioning meeting of the entity, it could result in recommendations or policy changes or
That's
et cetera.
like all meetings.
I think, like Bill was talking about, I think we draw the bright line on like IEP meetings. Those are meetings that are funded by the public, no doubt about it, and all that sort of stuff. But we're so down into the functional operation of the school, plus the students' right of privacy. I think we drive a bright line there. Kind of going back up there, those functional meetings, that's where I kind of scratch my head. So to answer your question, no, I don't think they need to be routinely scheduled or noticed up. And two, do have somebody who decides that they want to start attending those meetings, including trustees, talk about the appropriateness of it.
There are some school districts that just post on the third Tuesday of every month, we have an admin meeting at 10 o'clock and they just post it on their door.
Oh, so somebody, yeah.
So that's the way that they do it, they deal with it.
Yeah. So the answer is no, it doesn't need to be, but if you do, fine. And if somebody later complains about it, you got that notice up and say, well, I'll bet nobody ever shows up. Yeah. People who are required to be there will show up. Okay, well, so what meetings are open, but let's talk about what is a meeting. Montana's laws on open meeting are very liberal, meaning they're very focused on the public's right to know. And so our definition of meeting is also broad. And it's here in the middle or bottom third of page 31. There's two elements to it. A meeting is when you convene a quorum of whatever entity you're talking about, quorum of the board, for example, in our world. So as long as if you have a quorum of the board, I guess there's three elements that I listed out. Either a quorum in person or by electronic means. And we'll come back and talk about electronic means here in a little bit. And then the third one is very broad. To hear, to discuss, or act upon any matter that pertains to the school district. So it's very broad. That's why you've heard, have pounded into your head for as long as you've been involved in public schools, is you got to be very mindful of counting the noses of the trustees you're with. If you've got a 5-trustee board, And suddenly when you have a coffee clutch of 3 trustees, even if you're not talking about school stuff, people are going to start wondering if you are talking about school stuff and whether or not a violation of the meeting law occurred. So that's always kind of tricky. If you've got a 3 trustee board, let's do the paperwork and get you up to a 5 trustee board. Because the 3 trustee board is not functional. I don't know if there are any 3 trustee boards left in the state, but Brockton used to have a 3 trustee board, and I worked a lot with them. And I'll tell you, it was really tough because 2 trustees could not talk about anything school related. Now, did they? Theoretically, I suppose they did. But should they? No. And so that really is a limitation, that 2 people involved in the governance of the district cannot have a conversation. Because if you have a 5 trustee board, 2 trustees can have coffee and talk about school business every day if they want, because it's not a quorum of the board. And I would say at some level it's a healthy function of the board to have one-on-one communication at times. I think that's especially true of the board chairman, maintaining some sort of special relationship with the board, where the board chairman can then, have that individual connection with each trustee, so that if there are nuances or controversies or something, they can have that ability to communicate without violating the open meeting law. And I don't think that's even violating the open meeting law in spirit, certainly not in letter. I think it's healthy to have that ability to have that sort of conversation. Now, if it's abused, that's a problem, right? I mean, if the chairman goes to every trustee individually with the same conversation and reaches a consensus and then gets to the meeting and then votes without any discussion, you see what I'm suggesting is that violates the spirit of the open meeting law. Now, in the city of Billings, and I do a lot of work for the Billings School District, and knock on wood, they've been pretty quiet legally for the last several years. There was a period of time where I actually had to present monthly a legal report to the board monthly, and then I don't know how many, 6 or 8 lawsuits on it, but I mean, knock on wood. And every time I see the city of Billings getting in trouble, it's not the Billings School District or the county, because it just seems to cycle. But in the city of Billings once, there was an effort to actually, this is what they characterize it as, is kind of a plan or a conspiracy to avoid an open meeting by having a series of individual meetings with councilmen. And so they would have like a meeting with 2 council persons and then a meeting with 1 council. And they had the same discussion, as I recall, it had to do with, I think, the water park in the Heights. And it was, in other words, it sure sounds like there was an effort to have a series of private conversations to avoid having a conversation in the city council meeting itself. And that's not good. That's taking steps to avoid a public meeting. But what I'm talking about is constructive, helpful conversations about that. So, if you do have a new trustee who really doesn't understand the role of a board, and a new trustee starts doing things like going to staff meetings or wanting to talk to individual teachers, or a parent calls that trustee and the parent complains and the trustee decides to take it upon him or herself to actually fix the problem. Those are all things that a trustee can stumble into and get into trouble. I think an experienced board chairman, and generally board chairs are ones who've served for a while, can go to that trustee and say, okay, just so you know, we don't operate that way, and here's why. I think that's a very constructive way. So the definition of public meeting is very broad. Now let me go back and we'll talk a little bit about emails and other electronic ways we've discovered to torture ourselves. So you see that if you have a quorum of the board convening to discuss, hear, or act upon something, that's an open meeting. But it also says if a quorum of the board is in person or by electronic means. Now, way back when that statute was written, I think the intent was to allow a board of trustee or trustee to call in to a meeting by speakerphone and participate in the meeting that way, which is entirely fine. In fact, I encourage that. If you need to have everybody there, or you need to get a quorum of the board together, and because of lives and jobs and everything else, it's just so hard to gather people together. And you get people together, you don't have a quorum of the board. You thought you did, but you didn't get somebody or 2 people on the phone. Because if you get that trustee on the phone and you have a quorum, you can convene a meeting and do your business. And if the person has to peel off to go do their other stuff and leave the meeting electronically, that's fine. So I think the statute was written so that people could call into board meetings, because way back then we had speakerphones. That was the most sophisticated electronics we had. I mean, you remember when we had fax machines? I mean, that now seems like it. I was talking to somebody the other day, and I said, and my daughter was there, and I said something about a party line. And I said, how many of you grew up with party lines? Yeah, so you had to remember, you had to count the number of rings, right, before you answered your phone. And then, I know what we're talking about, is that we were talking about that it used to be that rich people had 2 lines, and it was listed in the phone book as teenager line. Remember that? And it was like, why would they do that? So because, my God, look at you, child. You're on your damn cell phone texting or talking or whatever. You know, now 23 out of the 24 days, and the other reason you're not on 24 is because you're in the shower for that other hour. Never mind, I'm just venting. So, you know, she was talking about a little this party line thing, and it's like, well, that's because, you know, teenagers talk on the phone a lot, and then we had party lines, and how you'd have to, you know, pick up the phone if somebody was talking, you'd have to wait patiently, or if they were really talking a long time, you'd have to ask them to interrupt. Or if you picked up the phone and there was nobody there, so somebody would obviously left their phone off the hook, so you whistle into it to try to catch that person's attention. How do they get on the party line?
We don't know.
Sorry.
So your kids do go to the dinosaur, right?
I am.
I have a question about electronic meetings. So, our board coach always, you know, in the past, you know, taught us you can't just call in and vote for something to get off.
Yeah.
So can you kind of talk a little bit
Yeah.
about the length of time?
Yeah. The conventional wisdom on that particular point is that trustees have an obligation to the board and the district. It's no coincidence you're called trustees. That is, I mean, like if you open a trust and you appoint somebody to be the trustee, that person has a fiduciary obligation to the entity, to the trust. So as trustees, you have that same fiduciary obligation. A fiduciary obligation is a heightened duty. So, you know, as a parent, I have a heightened duty to my child. As a trustee, I would have a heightened duty to the entity, the school district in this case. So the conventional wisdom of the theory is that a trustee would be breaching their fiduciary obligation to the district if they weren't adequately informed before voting on an issue. And so they should come in and vote either by uninformed arbitrarily or by some political leaning, not Democrat, Republican, but by some politics of the district. So I think the caution was, if you have a trustee who needs to call in, don't just have them call in for the vote and then leave, because on the surface it looks like that's kind of shoddy boardsmanship. That's the theory. Now, the times that theory doesn't necessarily play out is if it's a matter that you've discussed. So budget is a very good example. Say you've done your budget work all the way through however you do it. You know, some districts start really early, some don't start until August. The legislature's over, some don't start until June, July, August, whatever it is. But at some point, you have a budget meeting, and I can't remember if it's a specific date or a number of days after the August, whatever. In August, you have a budget meeting, and you have to approve your final budget. Now, let's say that trustee is away attending to a sick family member or at work and can only get away for long enough to take a call. I don't find, and this is just my personal opinion, I don't think it would offend their fiduciary obligation if under those circumstances they just called in and voted and left. Because they would have done the background work. They were prepared to vote. They knew exactly what they're voting on. Nothing changed. You can't call in and vote and left. It's better to have, in my opinion, it's better to have trustees participate as long as they're well informed than not, especially if you need a quorum.
What about retired? You just want all the time
When you're hiring somebody? Oh, well, you know, I think, again, I think I'd worry a little bit about whether the trustee did adequate background work on that. Or, if they were on the hiring committee for a superintendent, business manager, whatever, and the committee made a recommendation to hire somebody, and as it turns out, the board is actually going to do that, so that person actually has the background and did the legwork. I don't think that would necessarily be a problem. I mean, especially if you wouldn't have that trustee participate because of their work obligations otherwise, is I guess what I'd say, it'd be more important that way.
Electronic is really the best, Jeff, when it's a relative. You know, maybe a coaching position or something that nobody objects to. It's just the law to say it has
That's
to
a
be
good point.
everybody. And so it's really helped our district. And as far as I know, it hasn't even been a political problem. It's just getting everybody.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because in the context of nepotism, when the board is to hire a relative of a trustee, and we can look at those rules, they're antique rules, but they still apply. One of the things you have to have before you can hire a relative is you have to have the entire board, not just those who are attending, but the entire board vote on it, with the exception of the person who's the relative. So, sometimes it's really tough to get that hiring done because just of the nature of, and you've got a relatively large board, so just law of averages, it's hard to get everybody together in one place.
And Jeff,
so
not just vote on it, but unanimous. I mean,
that's exactly right. The entire board has to approve it. So it's, in that case, it's better to have somebody call in, weigh in for that second. I mean, if the person's at work and they can literally just do it on their break, it's better to have them do that than to slow the hiring process down and have to do it next. Okay, now, as to electronic means, here's where I think our next problem will arise, and that is with email, and now I add the word social media. Because if you have a quorum of the board hearing, discussing, or acting upon something, you've got an open meeting. And so an email exchange could easily fall into the pit of violating an open meeting law, in my estimation. And we're just kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop, and I really don't want it to be in the school districts I work with.
Say that again, I'm sorry.
Just start this beginning.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I'm just trying to remember. Were we just talking about email? Okay. My concern is that email communication could easily be a violation of the open meeting law. And this is how it goes. You have, let's go back in the antique days of just regular old email. And you have one trustee email all of the trustees and the superintendent and the parent and whoever, right? So in other words, there's a group of people receiving an email, and that trustee says, man, I don't think we should hire this particular person as the coach. I think we need to hire this particular person as the coach. And so that is a discussion. And then you have the parent weigh in and say, no, I really think you should hire this person, not that person. Now you're hearing the public's opinion on this point. But then the fatal flaw is you have one of the other trustees hit apply to all and say, well, I agree with the first trustee that we should hire this person or that person. What do you have? You actually have a discussion of the quorum of the board by way of electronic means. Now, we can fuss about whether or not it's contemporaneous discussion, whether it's really discussion as we conceptualize discussion, but obviously, we've all been involved in it. It is a chain of sentences of communication, and if you're discussing substantive issues, I think you've just fallen into the pit of an open meeting law violation. And we've come really close a couple times in school districts. We came close in school districts once, and we actually do have a case out of Flathead that we'll look at here in a minute. So this is the school law case, but it didn't create any law for us to be guided us. So I think it was Boulder. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think it was Boulder. I think the high school board had received a complaint, just informally, about a person, an employee, I think a coach. Let's name it a coach because whoever complains about anything other than coaching. So somehow the board got a hold of this issue concerning a coach, and so by email, the board discussed the fact that they had this complaint about a coach, and then the board, by way of email, decided that they should investigate it, and then they actually decided who to hire as an investigator. So we actually had a discussion and at least two decisions in that email exchange. The local newspaper found out about it and sued the school district. And what happened at that point is what saved the district from a lot of headache, but it also didn't give us any case law to live by. But an attorney in Helena, school attorney in Helena, Jeff Hinduit, maybe some of you know Jeff, was called in, and I know exactly what happened. I've never asked Jeff this, but I know exactly what happened. He came in, he looked at the record that they had at that point, and said, you guys are out of violation of the open meeting law. Let's get out of this thing as fast as possible. Because if you go through the court process, you're almost assuredly going to lose on these grounds. And once that happens, the newspaper can come in and ask the court to be reimbursed its attorney's fees. So that's the zinger. That's the enforcement mechanism of the open meeting public information laws. Is if you lose, you school district, you have to pay the whoever sued you's attorney's fees. And if you fight it all the way up to the Supreme Court, those of you who have been involved in litigation know how horribly expensive litigation is. Horribly expensive. I mean, because you've got a lot of people whose time is valued high, and they're spending a lot of time on something. And you've got litigation, you've got not only the papers you file, you've got interviews and depositions and hearings and trials that go on for days. So it can be very expensive. At one point, I don't remember what particular one was, but I'll look at my school district 2 folks. The Gazette prevailed, and the board ended up having to pay the Gazette, I want to say something in the neighborhood of $80,000. Do you guys remember that? It was big. Was it more than that? And so the whatever bully hell fight was occurring between the Billings School District and Gazette ultimately resulted in the Gazette prevailing, and the board had to swallow hard and turn over a check. And I think it was $80,000. Joe's remembering it was a little bit more, but a ton of money in other words. So that's the zinger. That's the enforcement mechanism for that. So we don't have that case out of Boulder because they had a really good lawyer come in and say, oh my God, let's get out of this. Then what they did is they did something called a confession of judgment, saying, we're not going to contest this, we're not going to do it anymore, we're going to stop, but let's have a really quick hearing to figure out how much the attorney's fees are so far, and we'll pay those. So in other words, they cut their losses. Now, it didn't give us any case law, but there's a case, and let me find it real quick so you can just see what the Supreme Court told us. I'll find it.
Jeff, while you're looking at it's true, is it not, that if the district should, by some slim chance, prevail, nobody's paying our legal fees?
Your insurance company may be paying
The other party.
Well, that's true. We'll have to look at the new public information law, but I think there is a possibility that you go to there's better grounds than this new statute to try to ask for insurance fees. Out of the old one, I don't think.
So the risk to the newspaper, for example, is limited if they think they will get their fees covered.
Yeah, it's an expensive proposition. Go to page 37. Right in the middle of page 37, there's a 2013 case out of Flathead, and it had to do with a planning committee of some kind. So you can well imagine, the Flathead where things are booming, and zoning and planning are always controversial, particularly in conservative communities. And I can well imagine that this neighborhood planning committee was fraught with controversy. But what that committee did is they had some sort of Yahoo email exchange that they were using, and to inform committee members of things. And the Supreme Court didn't have to decide, because of the nature of the case and what issues went up, and if any of you have been involved in litigation, you also know that litigation becomes very strange and kind of warped by the time it gets up to the Supreme Court. And oftentimes, there's a very narrow question the Supreme Court has to answer. And you're going to try to read it as a layperson and try to make sense out of why is that particular point so important. It's just like that's the nature of this. I mean, lawyers have brain functioning problems as far as I'm concerned. Because we have no problem arguing the alternative, which most people find offensive. It's like, well, we'll assert this argument, and if you don't buy that argument, let's assert this argument, and they may be contradictory arguments. We don't have any problem with that. It's called arguing alternative. We do that. But, so the Supreme Court didn't have to decide whether the email exchange was actually a violation, but you see, I've got italicized in bold right there in the manual 37. This is what the Supreme Court said. We affirm the district court's ruling based on the lack of evidence that such an electronic meeting occurred. However, given the constant evolving technology, we decline to state that a meeting could never be convened by way of a Yahoo email group. We therefore caution public officers that conducting official business via email can potentially expose them to claims of violating open meeting laws. It's unusual for the Supreme Court to kind of give warnings like that. So the lesson is, if your board members communicate by email, they need to be very, very cautious. Because if somehow a form of your board somehow discusses, hears, or even that acts upon something by way of an email, then you've got a problem. It also creates this problem for trustees. If they're communicating even through their private email system, say you got a Gmail account, if you're emailing over some controversy in the school district, and now suddenly there's a lawsuit over that controversy, it's very probable that your email, your personal email, will be subject to discovery in the litigation process. Meaning, we would, whoever, the other attorney would have to go to Gmail or Google and have you top up your emails on this, because they may be relevant to whatever the controversy is. And under the new federal evidentiary rules, that's very clear that it's subject to disclosure. Plus, if there is lawsuit, we have to, as counsel, tell you to preserve all of that, so you don't end up erasing something deliberately or accidentally, and we run afoul of the federal court. Because we don't want to, none of us want to be in front of a federal judge and have that federal judge look at you and say, you knew of this lawsuit and you had a warning not to dispose of your emails. Why is it that you deleted it? It's just not good news.
My understanding, they can still pull it up in your system.
Yeah, I don't know enough about that technology, and that's true, but then it suddenly does involve Google people and subpoenas, and you want to talk about things getting expensive fast, because the district would have to hire in consultants. We've had to do that in the past with stuff, and like if you're investigating computers for appropriate use, you have to bring in experts. So that's the second reason you really shouldn't use your email to communicate. Now, when is it permissible to use email?
My thought was, I don't know how many schools would do this. Given this day and age, we probably should be caching our emails that go to our system. So caching the emails.
Yes.
Because if you don't, and you wind up in that mess.
Yes, and it's true under the new public information laws. I mentioned that a couple times. Legislature last winter completely rewrote our public record laws, completely. Scrapped them all, the entire set of statutes that said these are public documents and this is how the public gets hold of public documents. Those statutes were literally just erased, and a whole new set of statutes were put into place, which I think was actually a very good change because it updated it. We no longer talk about public records, we talk about public information. And public information is essentially anything that you use in a school district, anything you generate, anything that you have or store or receive, and it's in any form. Actually, it's an electronic form or hard copy form. And relative to that public information, there's actually now, there will be schedules to determine how long you keep something and when you destroy it. And that's always been in place, but it's never really been exactly corresponding with our modern world. So there's a committee that's actually working on changing those schedules. So clerks need to be coming to this sort of thing. So when is it appropriate for boards to use email? I think it's a very good tool to communicate about meeting times and places. And also, I don't have any heartburn with the trustee notifying the chairman of the board that they'll be absent at the last minute. In other words, sorry, I can't make a meeting, or kick a sick kid. Those things are really not substantive discussions, but it's a good way to communicate back out. I don't think there's anything wrong with the superintendent sending out information to the board by way of email. It's very convenient. It's akin to the old packets that we used to mail out. A couple things is that communication is subject to public disclosure, and it really should be kept in the central office so the public can come in and say, I'd like to read the superintendent's newsletter. Some superintendents use that actually very effectively and broaden the list, the distribution list of those sorts of communications, newsletters or notice. But what I really encourage is if there is something to communicate about an upcoming meeting, the superintendent contact the trustees individually just to give them a heads up, rather than sending out electronics or emails or something like that. I don't think we just stop with the emails, because now we find public discussions occurring all the time on Facebook and other things. I don't know what they are, Twitter and Facebook and whatever. Snapchat, texting. So if there is a group discussion, and this is especially true of Facebook, because I think people actually form a Facebook page on a particular topic, like stupid things the superintendent is doing on the Facebook page. So and if you have trustees participating in that, you've got a problem, I think. I mean, a whole bunch of different levels, but you could have the opportunity. Okay. Just to get technical, again, I'm back on page 33. There's actually 4 kinds of meetings the board actually has, and every meeting that you have has to kind of fall into one of those categories. You have your organization meeting in May after the election. That generally is kind of hand in glove with a regular board meeting, but there is embedded in there someplace technically an organizational meeting. Sometimes boards will come together in a regular meeting right that night, and then adjourn that and then go into a special board meeting. That's fine. My caution is not to take controversial action in your last regular board meeting with the old board. I mean, if you know that the new board's coming on and doesn't agree or somehow will do something, so you're going to hurry up and try to change something, a hiring decision, a budget, whatever it is, I advise you not to do that because it's a train wreck. And I've seen it happen where, the old board members, 2 or 3 are going off the board and they need to do something. So, it's just like so blatant, the last board meeting, 5 minutes before the new board takes its seats, you've suddenly now got some controversial action taken. That's just, it flies in the face of it. So, I think if there's things that you can wrap up as the old board, you should do that, approval of minutes, maybe some action on it, that it would be unfair to put the new trustee in the hot seat. So then you have your organizational meeting where you hire your clerk and you elect your presiding officer. Then you have regular board meetings, and regular board meetings are noticed up through your policy. So I always stop and say, okay, go back and look at your policy, make sure your policy actually accurately reflects when you actually meet. Because if it's changed over time, you need to update your policy, because that's one more thing a clever lawyer will claim that you've done to violate. You didn't give adequate notice of your regular board meetings. When we posted it, well, your policy says this thing. Then in August, as I mentioned, you have a budget meeting. And then everything else on the statute, everything else is called a special board meeting. So they may be work sessions, they may be retreats, they may be joint meetings with another board to hear a particular item or to govern an athletic cooperative or something like that. But all those other meetings are special board meetings. Notice of all those. Notice of all those. The rule of thumb is you need to give 48 hours notice. Technically, the 48-hour notice only applies to special board meetings, and it's a right that trustees have to receive notice of the special board meeting. But what has happened in our world, we've got 48 hours in our mind as what needs to be noticed of for any board meeting. Good rule of thumb. But the Supreme Court has said really for like other meetings, even including a special board meeting, all the public needs is reasonable notice. So, reasonable notice could theoretically be less than 48 hours, but it's a rule of thumb that we follow. It's just follow the 48 hours.
How about emergency?
There's a provision that if you have a real emergency, you can actually do the evening. So, Healthy Project, when they're school burned down. Had an emergency meeting right away, and they had to figure out what to do. Those are exceptions to the notice. And they're special board meetings with emergencies. Don't make up emergencies. You know, if you're fortunate enough to get some oil and gas money and it's late in the year and the emergency is you need to spend money, so yeah, I don't think so. Okay. Public comment. I've got, starting on page 33, some notations concerning public comment. I think public comment comes into play in two different ways. One is there's a statute that requires you to have public comment on any agenda of your board and committees and that sort of thing. That statute was put in place, I don't know, I bet it's been 10 years ago now. And who knows what public meeting some fellow was denied the right to speak. I just know what happened. There was some weed control board someplace, and some guy was, shrill, and the board had it and said, no, we're not going to let you talk anymore. Shut up. Well, that person went to the legislator, and now in the law it says every meeting has to have on its agenda the right for the public to speak. So I would call it the open microphone provision. That gives the public the right to stand up and speak on matters that pertain to the school. They can't necessarily stand up and talk about immigration or keeping Muslims out of our country or the fact that the road, the highway leading to town needs to be replaced, fixed. That's all very interesting, and I'm glad, sir, you have an opportunity to speak in the public about this, but sit down, that we don't have any control over immigration law. So it has to be within your jurisdiction. And theoretically, it's supposed to be something that's not otherwise on the agenda. Now, so that's public comment generically. Then there's specific public comment. And public comment specific should come essentially after the board has made a motion, but before the board takes a vote. Now, if you did that on every single vote you took, your meetings would really be stretched out. That's because the routine matters are, okay, that makes really good sense. Everybody's on the same page. Motion approved, second yes. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye. You just do it that fast. But if there's something that people are there to talk about or talk to, at that point you would stop and you'd say, are there members of the public who wish to speak on this? Now, a good way to manage that is actually have a sign-up sheet or sign-in pages where the person who wants to speak actually has to fill out their name and the topic and give it to the clerk, and then the clerk gives it to the board chairman and kind of manage it. So if you've got a lot of people, that's a good way to manage it. The other advantage of having people fill out a sheet to speak, which you can do because that controls the decorum and the flow of the meeting. It gives the board chairman some control over the comment on a particular issue. And it comes in this way. Is one, the board chairman has to call the person by name specifically. And let's say you put a time limit on it, which you have to do sometimes. And that person comes up, they give their 3 minutes, and then the board chairman gets to call the next person. So now I don't mean this to be kind of sneaky, but the board chairman can control a lot of the energy of the discussion by the placement of the speakers. So if it's pro or con, or it's shrill person and let's do a quick comment sort of thing, I'm just suggesting that the board chairman can actually make it a more productive meeting by having that sort of control over the order of speaking. I always suggest that you ask them to come forward to the front of the room and stand at the lectern, because that takes the whole dynamic of just being able to sit back in the chair and complain. I also suggest in public comment everybody gets one shot. Every member of the public gets one shot. I've been to meetings where the chairman doesn't call people to come forward, and it's just kind of a group of chairs, and it's just an open discussion. And the board, the people just interrupt and they just say their point 16 different times. Or when somebody else finishes talking, that person wants to offer a rebuttal. No, that's not a right that they have. They have a right to participate, observe, and the board chairman has the authority and the right to control the decorum of the meeting. So
public comment, public debate.
Yes. In public comment, public debate. What did you say?
I said it's public comment, not just.
Oh, yes, public comment. That's exactly right. It's also school board meeting held in public. It's not the public's school board meeting. Does that make sense? It's the board. I always say, if you've got somebody in the audience who's shrill and wants to talk about everything, say, gosh, go down to the clerk's office and fill out a damn application to run for the board. If they really want to be on the board, let them run. Let there be a number of trustees who would happily let that person on the board. So, yes, Nancy.
The other thing on public comment, the whole thing is so that the board can hear it, but they don't comment back.
Right.
They sit there quietly, they listen to the comment, then the board chair will say something like, thank you for your comment, and we'll consider it, or whatever. Because you can't take action for something that's not on your agenda. So go ahead.
No, that's exactly right. And so the first kind of open mic provision, when that came into place, that became the conventional wisdom, and this is why. And it really is confusing to trustees, and it's very confusing to your patrons when they come to a public meeting. They don't generally come to the board meeting. They've got some important thing, and they stand up and make a statement, and they ask a question, and all the trustees just stare blankly back at that person. It's really confusing to that public member because they have no idea. So it's often helpful to explain that the reason in the public comment section of our agenda we don't engage in discussion is that topic wasn't noticed up to discuss. And the public has a right to know what we're going to discuss. That's why we put out an agenda. And so we won't discuss something that isn't on our agenda, right? And that's why you don't feed back to the people who stand, because that's what, half the time people will ask a question. Many times it's a legitimate question. The chairperson will generally refer that question to the superintendent to attend to.